Hello, hello. Welcome to another edition of Proofs from Math. Super exciting with my lovely voice. Today we're going to talk about congruent complements and supplements. Remember that complementary angles add up to 90 and supplementary angles add up to 180. So first of all, given that 1 and 2 are supplementary, so that means that these two add up to 180. And 2 and 3 add up to 180. Find the measure of angle 3. Well, if 1 and 2 add up to 180, then that means that angle 2 is 130 degrees. And then since angle 2 and 3 are supplementary, then that means angle 3 has to be 50 degrees in order to equal 180. So what do you notice? That angle 1 is congruent to angle 3 because if angles are supplementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. Okay. We can apply the same logic to the complements. So complementary means adds up to 90. So if measure of angle 1 is 50, then that means measure of angle 2 is 40 degrees. And since 2 and 3 are complementary, that means the measure of angle 3 is 50 degrees. Notice that angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. Reason being, if angles are complementary to the same angle, then they are congruent. Okay. All right, let's continue on. So 1 and 2 are supplementary, 3 and 4 are supplementary, and angles 1 and 4 are congruent. So angle 1 is 50, so that means measure of angle 2 has to be 130. Measure of angle 4 is 50 since they are congruent, which means then that measure of angle 3 is also 130 degrees. So we can say that the measure of angle 2 is congruent to the measure of angle 3. And the reason being is because if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. Okay. And then we have the same thing for complementary. So if 1 and 2 are complementary, then that means the measure of angle 2 is 40 degrees. 1 and 4 are congruent, so that means the measure of angle 1 is 50 degrees. So 3 and 4 are complementary, so this is also 40 degrees. So measure of angle 2 is congruent to measure of angle 3, because if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. So here are 2 more definitions. Well, technically 4, for you guys to memorize and know how to use. Okay. All right, next slide. So it says, use the congruent supplements and congruent complement theorems to help solve the following. So if A is complementary to angle B and B is complementary to angle C, then that means that angle A is congruent to angle B. The reason being is because if angles are complementary to the same angle, then the angles are congruent. Okay. All right, in the next example, it says angle A is supplementary to angle D. Angle E is supplementary to G, so we can say that AG is, and we know that angle A is congruent to angle G. Then we can say that angle E is congruent to angle D, because if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. So again, it's just taking these new definitions that we're learning and applying them. All right, let's use these with some algebra first before we start with the proofs. So it says A and B are supplementary. So that means that angle A plus angle B equals 180. C and D are supplementary. And measure of angle A is congruent to the measure of angle C. So we have, if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. So since supplementary, these two are congruent, it follows that angle B is congruent to angle D. Okay, we know the measure of angle B, it is negative x plus 60, and we know the measure of angle D, it's 5x. Where do we get that? From the problem. So add the x to both sides, 60 equals 6x, divide by 6, x equals 10. Then I need to find the measure of angle A and the measure of angle B. Well, let's find B first, since we have an equation for it. So negative 10 plus 60 is 50 degrees. And then A and B are supplementary, so that means the measure of A has to be 130 degrees. Okay. All right, next example. Angle C is complementary to angle A, which means they add up to 90. Angle A plus angle T equals 90. So if angles are complementary to the same angle, so both C and T are complementary to the same angle, then the angles are congruent. So we can say that C is congruent to angle T. Okay, so we don't even need to worry about this right now because we know that C and T are congruent. So we set 34 minus 11x equal to 46 minus 7x. And we get 4x to equal negative 12 and x equals negative 3. Remember that it's okay if it's a negative number, it's just that when we plug it back in, we can't have a negative number. So the measure of angle C is going to be 34 minus 11 times negative 3, which gives me 67 degrees. Remember that the measure of angle C and the measure of angle T is supposed to be congruent because they are complementary to the same angle. And sure enough, that equals 67 degrees. And then the problem still wanted us to find the measure of angle A. Well, both of these angles are complementary to measure of angle A, so 90 minus 67 gives me 23 degrees. Okay. All right, last arithmetic problem, and then we have a couple proofs. So 1 and 2 are complementary, which means they add up to 90 degrees. And 3 and 4 are complementary, so they add up to 90 degrees. Measure of angle 2 is 4x plus 3, and measure of angle 3 equals 5x minus 7. Find x and measure of angle 3. So at first look at this problem, it might think we might not have enough information, but we actually do. We can see that angle 1 and angle 4 are vertical angles. what do we know about vertical angles? They are congruent. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. And if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent, which means that angle 2 has to be congruent to angle 3. So 4x plus 3 equals 5x minus 7, so x equals 10. So the measure of angle 3 is 5 times 10 minus 7. So again, we proved that 1 and 4 were congruent because vertical angles are congruent. And then it follows that if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent themselves. Okay, last page of notes. Alrighty, so we have that angle 1 is supplementary to angle 2. Angle 3 is supplementary to angle 4. And we know that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4. This is all from the given. Okay, and if you look at the diagram, you can see that these form linear pairs. Remember that linear pairs are supplementary. They add up to 180 degrees. Okay. Well, this one's actually pretty quick because we already know that we have two pairs of supplementary angles, and we already know that one of those from each is congruent to itself. So we can go ahead and say that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3 because if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. Okay. All right, next example. So the problem gives us that angle 1 is complementary to angle 2. Angle 3 is complementary to angle 4. And angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So again, this is a pretty quick proof because we already know that we have two pairs of complementary angles, and we already know that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. So we can conclude that angle 1 is congruent to angle 4 because if angles are complementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. Okay. All right. Last example. This one's going to be a little bit more involved. So we only know so far that angle 2 is congruent to angle 3. That's the only thing that was given to us. Okay. We can see from the diagram that angles 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 make a linear pair, but we have to prove that. So we can assume that angle 1 and angle 2 form a linear pair, and that angle 3 and angle 4 form a linear pair. And that is assumed from the diagram. Remember that you can assume straight lines, so assumed from diagram. And then same as 2. All right, so all we know so far is that angles 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 are a linear pair. We have not shown that they are supplementary, so that needs to be our next step. So angles 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. And then we would say that for 5, angle 3 and angle 4 are supplementary. And the reason being is if angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. And we would say same as 4 for the next one. Okay. All right. So we showed that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 form a linear pair. We now showed that 1 and 2 are supplementary and 3 and 4 are supplementary. And we know from the given that 2 and 3 are congruent. So we can now go ahead and apply our theorems to this. That angle 1 and angle 4 will be congruent because if angles are supplementary to congruent angles, then the angles are congruent. Okay, so I know sometimes you just want to jump to the end because it looks like you can, but you've got to remember that you have to prove all of this information first, that it forms a linear pair. That you can assume from the diagram, but then you have to say that these are supplementary before you can use this. So notice how it always kind of like goes like this when you're making a line. So like I formed that they were supplementary, now I'm allowed to use this. Okay, or I knew that this is a linear pair, now I can use this next definition. So it kind of always goes like in this diagonal on these two-step proofs. As always, you guys, thanks so much for taking the time to listen. Hope you all have a wonderful day.